Thank you, Cindy. All right, welcome everyone to our last educational session for the Climate Change Comprehensive Plan Amendment Committee for the City of Gig Harbor, CCCPAC. I'm going to share my screen and get this presentation rolling. All right, can everyone see that? Okay, great. Okay, so again, housekeeping, please keep your cameras on, and if you're not actively speaking, please mute yourself to avoid any feedback. Can I get a volunteer for a note taker for today? We have some really awesome presentations, and I want to make sure we capture everything. Preferably someone that hasn't done it before. Nobody wants to do it today.
This is Jason. I'll do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. I was glad I didn't have to just pick someone. And then if you haven't sent me any notes from our transportation and land use or any of the other sessions, I would really appreciate if you sent along your homework to goals or policies related to the topics that we've covered.
Roxy, can you remind me what level of detail you want these notes to be at?
It seems like a lot of note takers have just kind of done, not necessarily stream of consciousness, but mainly bullet points from each of the presenters. It should serve as a complement to the presentations because the presentations will be on the website as well.
Okay.
Thank you. So as a recap from our last session, we talked about transportation and land use with Leah Missick from FutureWise and Tim Tromovic from, oh gosh, what was his? No, Tim was from FutureWise and Leah was from Climate Solutions, excuse me. So these concepts of transportation and land use are intrinsically tied. And Tim let us know that compact urban growth areas with densities of 8 to 9 units per acre have been shown to be the most helpful for climate change mitigation. It's important to plan for increased stormwater runoff and flooding as we experience more intense climate events. And electrifying everything will avoid retrofitting costs and help reduce fossil fuel usage. I have a project update, and it's so great that we have Sarah Fox from the Department of Commerce here today to maybe talk a little bit about this, but I applied for the Early Action Climate Planning Grant from the Department of Commerce, and we were recently awarded just over $76,000 to complete this comprehensive plan amendment process and to complete a climate action plan in the first half of next year. So thank you so much to Growth Management Services, and we're really excited to take on this work. So timeline, we are in our last education session. Tomorrow I will be doing a study session with council to talk about what we've learned from the CCCPAC process and how we're going to go forward. In August, I will reconvene you all and kind of do kind of like a planning commission or a council style study session where we review things and then ask for recommendations from you all how to move along with this comp plan amendment process. And then we'll start the legislative process for the comp plan amendment likely mid-September. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sarah Fox. She is the Climate Program Manager with Growth Management Services at the Washington Department of Commerce. So I will stop screen sharing and Sarah, let you take it away.
Unmute myself too. Okay, get all the right buttons clicked. Well, hello everyone. I'm Sarah Fox, and with me today is actually my entire team. I have Michael Burnham here and Gary Eidelberg, and we are the small climate program team from Commerce. Small but mighty, some like to say, right? So at the Department of Commerce, we strengthen communities through every aspect of community development by providing financial aid and technical assistance, just like we did for you by providing the Climate Early Action Grant. Our team is centered within the Growth Management Services Department. So why we're here and why now? In 2021, the legislature gave Commerce a head start on climate planning, and they asked us to deliver a model climate change element that cities and counties could use to adopt into their 20-year comprehensive plans. As you all know, local comprehensive plans are updated every 10 years, and you're within that 2024 cycle. The climate change element is actually considered at this moment to be voluntary, but we consider it to be in good company with other good planning and tools such as the economic development chapters and parks. So I'm going to provide a quick overview, and then Michael and Gary are going to give you a little bit more detail as they're both leading particular aspects of this project. So the overview is that the model element will include two sub-elements, a mitigation sub-element and a resilience sub-element. And within these overall model element, the policies that we provide need to maximize co-benefits and prioritize actions that will uplift communities that have historically been impacted by climate change. We were given about 2 years to do the project. I came on board in September and the rest of my team joined me in October. But where we're at in this schedule that you see before you would be the design phase. So the initialization phase is really just establishing partnerships and finalizing contracts. And then the definition phase is where we gathered hundreds of model measures that our partners and collaborators had provided to us from their area of expertise. And then this phase, what we did, and we're going to showcase this right at the end, if we're going to try to stick to our 30 minutes here, but we'll showcase kind of what we did with all of those measures. And they were really supposed to be kind of the best examples from each of the contributors' expertise, be it a city planner, county planner, or a state agency, scientist. So we had quite an array of measures provided to us. And then the next phase will be the momentum phase, where we are basically launching a pilot program where we're going to be testing this model and the companion guidance in 3 cities throughout the state. We'll also be incorporating prioritization methods and guidance that we'll be getting from another group that's working with us, which is from Front and Centered, and they'll be leading a team they are leading a team of 8 community members that were selected from areas in the state that are considered to be the most overburdened by climate change. And so they'll be bringing their voices and lens to the project. And we'll be wrapping up this entire project February, where we will be providing kind of that final draft for everyone to begin really giving us their thoughts, what's working, what's not working. We'll be checking back with all our stakeholders and incorporating any changes they see, and then delivering it to the state in June. As I mentioned, we have a lot of folks that we're collaborating with on this project. We have 6 state agencies that are part of our that are actually being paid through the state proviso that we have. That's the Department of Ecology, Transportation, Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, Health, and the Emergency Management Division are all considered our state partners. And then we also have other partners that include the expertise of our tribal communities. As I mentioned, our frontline communities, FEMA, and others. Again, maybe this slide isn't, I'm thinking about this slide now, but you're well aware that you're within that 2024 round of updates, and including climate change now really does help all of you prepare for all the changes to come in the next 20 years. And we provided $2.2 million in grants to 27 communities within the Central Puget Sound area, and they range in activities from increasing resilience activities, doing that sort of planning, to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and VMT. So we have a range of activities that communities are going to be engaging in over this next year. And with that, I'm going to shift to Gary and have him talk to you a little bit more about what's the mitigation sub-element is all about.
Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, thanks, Sarah. I'm Gary Eidelberg. I'm the lead for the section developing the mitigation sub-element part of this project. And the definition of mitigation in the context of this project refers to efforts to reduce and or prevent the emission of greenhouse gas emissions. The two general objectives of this effort are, one, to help achieve statewide greenhouse gas reduction goals, and also to reduce vehicle miles traveled and per capita vehicle miles traveled across the state. Both of these things would be done ostensibly through GMA comprehensive plans prepared by cities and counties. Next slide, please. This is a list of the most common and significant sources, greenhouse gas emission sources across Washington state. And one of our main objectives of producing a model mitigation element is to provide actionable strategies that a city or county could adopt and implement through their GMA comprehensive plan. Then these would in turn reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from from these sources. Next slide, please. The mitigation sub-element, it's Sarah mentioned, will have two main components. One is a guidance section, and then an actual model mitigation element or sub-element, complete with sample goals and policies that a jurisdiction could adopt and implement. The guidance is centered around three main strategies, and these would ultimately help a jurisdiction reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. The first strategy is based on developing an emission inventory, which I'm sure a number of you have probably been involved with. And in developing an emission inventory, it would lead to identifying the most significant greenhouse gas emission sources. And of course, this would be after a number of technical steps. And then you would be choosing emission reduction targets. And then after choosing those targets, deciding on goals and policies that you would need to reduce or eliminate these emissions. The goals and policies the second strategy would be based on an emissions estimate process. The emissions estimate process is a less technically rigorous process that's built on a Department of Ecology survey, which has eight or so very extensive questions in a questionnaire that lead a jurisdiction to identify greenhouse gas emission sources, albeit more anecdotally than with an emission inventory, and then establish greenhouse gas reduction targets, and then, as I mentioned before, develop or choose and adopt effective goals and reduction and greenhouse gas reduction policies. Now, I need to make sure everyone understands relative to these two strategies, in the context of these two strategies, the statewide emission inventory and vehicle miles traveled surveys can't be disaggregated from the state level to the city and county level. And so that's why both of these strategies are directed directly at the county and city level to be developed. And in the guidance, it speaks extensively in how a city or county can make both of those happen. The third strategy directs a jurisdiction to directly choose goals and policies that Commerce, or we at Commerce, have developed and adopt and implement them toward greenhouse gas emission sources that have been identified. And these may be identified relative to the state emission inventory or relative to emission inventories of neighboring jurisdictions. Before I forget, the Washington Department of Transportation, or WashDOT, is working concurrently on a way to allow statewide VMT data to be disaggregated to county and city level data so that you can develop your own VMT targets. This slide here, this represents a summary of how guidance and model goals and policies should inform jurisdictions.
Gary, just a minute. We have a
Yeah,
question.
I have a question.
Roxanne.
Yes,
Yeah.
please. Yeah,
Thank you, Sarah. Would you mind going back to the last slide?
yes.
Just because it seems like choosing measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or VMT wouldn't be as effective without like an emission estimate. So is that just for folks that maybe don't have access to
Yeah,
emission estimating
yeah,
tools? Or
these are three options that we have. If you're unable or can't afford an emission inventory, and you don't have the resources to develop the emission estimate, the measures that we've developed at Commerce have been designed, or they've been developed so that we know that they have been proven to be effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So
For example, if you're changing a fleet from gas-powered fleet to electric fleet, things like that are already pretty well established. So,
okay, gotcha.
And the model needs to be something that's attainable for jurisdictions of, any size. So like you were alluding to, that if you don't have much capacity on staff, number 3 as a choice might be the way to go, to choose some measures that are just, definitely demonstratively effective.
Okay.
now
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, you are correct. The one drawback that it does have is that you can't, you don't have a baseline, and
Yeah.
it's harder to look at targets, and it's harder to tell how much progress you've made in the future. But
Okay.
we can discuss that more. Let's see. So we're at yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. We lost the
Shoot,
slides.
I hit the wrong button. Sorry. There we
Okay.
go. Sorry about that.
Okay. This slide presents a summary of how the guidance and model goals and policies should inform jurisdictions on how they can address the reduction of greenhouse gases in GMA comprehensive plans. And as I was referring to just a second ago, an important stipulation plus a requirement that we have from the legislative proviso is that the greenhouse gas reduction goals and policies that we recommend or we provide as models must have a demonstrated ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, anything that you pick from our list is going to be effective to a certain degree. And then some goals and policies must also or will also be presented as direct enabling or enabling policies or goals for other greenhouse gas emission reduction actions to take place. Next slide, please. All of the sample or model mitigation goals and policies will have been pre-evaluated for technical effectiveness in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Feasibility means can a county or city, do you have the authority to do them and adopt them and implement them? And last but certainly not least is environmental justice and equity issues. The goals and policies, once adopted, should not burden or harm already vulnerable communities. We also hope to have model mitigation goals and policies that will overlap or do double duty for us in enhancing efforts such as improving housing affordability, tribal mitigation efforts, and efforts to improve and support a whole ecosystems. Mitigation efforts in the long run need to enhance resilience and adaptation efforts, and resilience efforts can't occur effectively without mitigation efforts. Next slide, please. I want to reiterate that all of our model goals and policies will be vetted and prioritized relative to environmental justice and equity concerns. We don't want to recommend any goals or policies that would, if adopted, have unintended consequences on communities that are already vulnerable to negative impacts from climate change. We also don't want to add any economic problems or social burdens to communities that are already struggling with poverty or with other social inequities. Costs and benefits that need to be equitably distributed by communities and any actions that are going to be through any actions that are going to be taken toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael to discuss some things about the resilience sub-element.
Hey, thanks, Gary. So now I want to go into some deeper detail, like Gary did, about the companion resilience sub-element. And this will incorporate planning guidance as well as goals and policies like the mitigation sub-element. But this one will be focused on climate preparedness, response, and recovery. So in our draft resilience planning guidance, which is undergoing initial edits from our stakeholders, we've incorporated definitions and planning best practices from the American Planning Association, FEMA, NOAA's U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and other sources. That's because early on, our partners underscored that our guidance should leverage existing planning tools and provide some flexibility for communities to meet them where they're at in the process of planning for climate change. So the definition of resilience you see here on the screen comes from a FEMA guidebook, and it incorporates preparedness and response, which can include hazard mitigation and closely related climate adaptation, all to build the capacity of communities to withstand and recover from climate disruptions, whether they're wildfires, severe drought, coastal inundations, landslides, etc. Next slide, please. So the budget proviso notes that our resilience sub-element must include guidance that local governments may use to not only plan for climate impacts, but also develop and implement policies. So in a nutshell, the planning guidance must show communities how to identify and address natural hazards exacerbated by climate change, identify and protect and enhance natural areas and habitat, and also develop resilient infrastructure, both traditional infrastructure such as bridges and roads, and green infrastructure such as bioswales and engineered wetlands. So as noted earlier, the companion menu of measures, goals, and policies must recognize and promote co-benefits, such as those Gary featured on the previous slide, and support environmental justice. Next slide, please. So Commerce's draft resilience planning guidance suggests that all local jurisdictions start from the same place, and they'll start by forming a multidisciplinary team and using a University of Washington Climate Impacts Group tool to analyze expected changes in the climate. So think about indicators such as the number of extreme heat days like today, or changes in seasonal precipitation, warmer, wetter winters with higher stream flows, for example. And also use the tool to analyze climate-related hazards, again, droughts, wildfires, et cetera, all to identify how they could worsen climate impacts in your community and perhaps create ecosystem, infrastructure, and societal stress. So UW is now testing a beta version of this online tool, and I'm really excited about it because it'll display and summarize at the county level changes in the climate, water cycle, and climate-related hazards. So this tool will be very similar to the climate planning tool you see here on the screen, which UW created a few years ago. We'll have a few more whistles and bells built in. Next slide, please. So steps 1 and 2 are forming a project team and assessing the science. We're recommending that a third foundational step that communities take is applying the scientific knowledge in a plan and policy audit. So they would use a standard checklist that we're drafting now to identify existing policies in their comprehensive plan that foster climate resilience, either explicitly or implicitly, as well as use the checklist to identify opportunities to amend or supplement those policies with ones perhaps from the menu of measures or other sources. The upshot here is that we're designing our planning guidance to be highly flexible, offering communities several pathways, which you see here in the blue boxes on the screen, pathways to develop and integrate climate resilience goals and policies into their plan. So I'll give you an example. Here in Thurston County, the county and its largest cities, Olympia included, have drafted climate mitigation and resilience plans. So they might choose to take pathway 1, integrating existing goals and policies from those plans into their comp plan. But they also might identify some gaps in that plan and policy audit. And so they might choose to supplement their existing climate goals and policies with ones from our menu of measures. So it could be a combination of pathways 1 and 2. That's kind of to give you an example of that flexibility baked into this process. So pathways 3 and 4 you see on the screen are a little bit more labor intensive, as they would include conducting a vulnerability and risk assessment to develop more locally tailored resilience goals and policies. So a community might opt to take pathway 4, for example, if it intends to update its existing hazard mitigation plan, and then adopt that plan by reference in the comprehensive plan. As you might recall, House Bill 1099, which didn't pass this last legislative session, had some language in there that would allow jurisdictions to adopt their hazard mitigation plan by reference in their comprehensive plan, so long as it was consistent with our climate planning guidance. You might also know that as of April of next year, FEMA will require all local governments updating their hazard mitigation plans to include the effects of climate change and other future conditions in that plan's required risk assessment. So the upshot here is that that's going to be required going forward. And so we anticipate that a lot of communities may choose to adopt their hazard mitigation plan in their comp plan to satisfy this requirement. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, we'll be pilot testing this guidance in 3 Washington communities starting this fall. And I'm excited about it because we'll be able to test this UW climate impacts tool in the real world and see how it works. It'll also enable us to iron out any wrinkles in this draft resilience planning guidance. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about our planning guidance, we're going to go into some greater detail about the companion menu of measures that Sarah mentioned. So in the next few slides, Sarah, Gary, and I are going to give a live demo of our Smartsheet tool. It's a goal and policy database. And this will be the basis for what we hope to create an online dashboard on our website. And if you think about this dashboard, it could be a landing place for any community, such as Gig Harbor, and they could type in a specific hazard they're dealing with, such as sea level rise or extreme heat events. And the dashboard would produce a suite of policies they could perhaps adopt in their comprehensive plan. So we're collecting a lot of background data right now. Again, as Gary mentioned, assessing each of these policies for their co-benefits, looking at equity and environmental justice, and we'll be prioritizing these in coming months. So a lot of this will be baked into that dashboard concept. At this point, we have about 120 policies, both mitigation and resilience, that support 22 distinct goals. And those goals are within 12 categories, those that you see on the screen here, such as healthy ecosystems, health, agriculture, water resources, transportation, et cetera. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Sarah to give you a live demo.
All right. I just need to get rid of the screen for a second. There we go. Hopefully you can all see the screen I'm showing you now, which is, this is Smartsheets, and it's really just a database that allows us to do a lot of collaborating in real time with all of our partners. As I mentioned earlier, we have the state agency partners, and then we have about 3 different groups that also have been submitting measures to this database. And what this screen is showing you right now is just a collapsed view of those 12 categories. And then let's see. And then we will, we're going to focus in on a couple of them, but what we're going to show next is that we have a a larger spreadsheet that has a lot more columns with more information, because what we're doing is really sorting through each of these, everything that we receive. So we received, when it came in, it was number 385 when this particular measure came in. And what we've been doing over the last month is sorting them by what we think makes a really good goal, and then finding the other measures that really make good supportive policies. And so the second column here is the way we've basically organized to show them together as a set. And so you have the goal as 385, and then you have the associated policies. And our first step with our partners right now, which not a lot of folks see, like I said, it's about 200 partners, but we've asked them to first look at each one of those 12 sections and look at the goals and say, and tell us if they find any gaps. Is there any goal that really should be there that's missing? And then after they've looked through that, then perhaps do the same kind of study of, are there any policies that really should be within this goal, or is there a policy that really should be a goal, and likewise. So really just kind of go back and check our work and make sure we're not missing anything big. And then during our next step with our partners is going to be reviewing these, going deeper, as we were mentioning, but deeper meaning we're going to start providing the science to these measures as to why and how this is most effective, because the legislature asked us to provide a set of mitigation measures that have demonstrated ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So our next step is identifying which one of these measures actually do that and why and how they do it, so that a local jurisdiction can really be well informed as to the decisions on what they may choose to move forward with. And then also we'll be applying those lenses that I was mentioning from our front and centered communities and others as to how best to help prioritize those things, those measures as well, that really meet all those other goals that we have for climate change that might not be something you can necessarily measure with a study that's out there in existence right now. And so why don't I know we're running out of time. I feel like we're running long, so sorry. So maybe Gary, just pick out one of your either transportation or zoning goal, and then I'll have Michael zoom in on one of his goals as well. So which one do you want, Gary, transportation or zoning?
To the zoning.
Okay. So we'll zoom down to 32.
Yeah,
here,
32. And yes, this is a mitigation goal. It's very straightforward. Foster higher density land uses and mixed use urban villages and transit corridors. And I picked this one because this is also an example of an enabling policy. Doing this does not directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but if you foster higher intensity land uses in urban villages and transit centers, it looks to enable lower vehicle miles traveled and fewer trips, and therefore fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And then we can go to the next one.
Yeah, we'll switch to Michael just to save time. Okay.
Sure, Sarah. I'll do emergency management.
Okay.
So I'll focus on this one. Baked into this emergency management goal is enhancing emergency preparedness, response, and recovery. And it has, I think at my count, 11 supportive policies that will collectively enhance resilience by building the community's capacity to reduce climate risks, adapt to unavoidable impacts. Again, that's what we mean by adaptation, and then bounce back quickly or recover. Again, sort of the essence of what we mean by climate resilience. The first policy you see here beneath the emergency management goal is mapping transportation infrastructure that's vulnerable to repeated floods and or landslides, and developing alternative travel routes. This one came from the Thurston Climate Adaptation Plan. In fact, it's already been integrated into Thurston County's comprehensive plan. So this is a good example of how you can take a policy from your existing climate plan and put it into your comprehensive plan, and perhaps your hazard mitigation plan for that matter. Other policies within this emergency management section relate specifically to boosting wildfire prevention and preparedness, and creating community resilience hubs, such as cooling centers that are activated on days like this.
All right. So that is the end of our presentation. We really just need to share with you that kind of those key points in the schedule coming up, but our pilot program is launching soon in September. And then we're planning to have our second listening session with our tribal representatives in October. And then February is kind of our big, show and tell of like, this is what we've heard, this is what we've put together as a almost done draft. And so, yeah, are there any questions that you may have for us?
Hi, this is Jenny Wook, and I do have a couple of questions for you. I was especially interested in when Michael was talking about land use and zoning, and there's a part of your presentation which I think I heard a lot about flexibility, and about each city has different needs and of what we need to do for each city. How much of this is going to be an absolute requirement, and how much of this is going to be according to each individual city?
Well, for now, the climate change work that we're doing is all considered voluntary. So we have no mandates yet. We were expecting some mandates when we started work. There was a House bill that was proposed 2 years in a row that would have made elements of our climate change required, like the resilience element was going to be required in all communities, and the mitigation element was going to be required in only the largest counties. But since it didn't pass, our guidance is moving forward as just providing good advice to those communities that are voluntarily moving forward with climate change planning.
So I know our community is concerned and about the loss of single family zoning in already areas, not in new areas. I think that new areas to have increase in units is certainly a doable thing. But are you expecting cities to go back and redo their current zoning already, and to take single family zoning and just put in more units? Is that, I mean, I think what he showed us was 10 units per acre. That's a lot in a little town.
Yeah.
When our growth target numbers are already met for 2030, that's a lot.
Yeah, there's a little bit of overlap here with the climate change and the work that they've been doing with housing policies. And one of them is House Bill 1220 that passed, I think it was last year or 2 years ago now. And it is requiring city jurisdictions to plan for their total population by looking at all of the incomes that need housing and all of the housing types, because what we've found is about 70% of our cities overall have just one type of housing. And so then we are left without meeting the needs of most of, a large part of our communities are not finding housing within particular income bands, be it even not just low income, but there's lots of income bands that aren't being met. And so they will be looking, most communities should be looking at their zoning and making some decisions about where it's appropriate to increase and allow for different housing types. It's, you don't always, I like to use my own community as an example. It's an older community, was built in the 1900s, but on every block there's a duplex or a triplex that's built within, we see them all over the place, and those are considered what they call the middle housing type that hasn't been built for about 50 years. And so I think that's more of what the state and others are asking for communities to be considering, is to allow those types of housing within neighborhoods to really provide more housing and different housing types. But it is also in alignment with climate action goals, because it really does help the environment when we have folks living in places that already have impacted the world. You know, that we've already built the roads and the utilities, and there's usually businesses and transportation close to these existing neighborhoods. Whereas if we continue to build on the fringes, we are using a lot more energy to serve those residences. Does that answer your question?
But sort of, I mean, it seems to me like requiring a certain number of units is not really following the goals of the GMA and population numbers. And so that's a question, but I guess it's voluntary right now. It's my understanding there's supposed to be a housing needs assessment tool coming from Department of Commerce. Do you know anything about that?
I know a little bit, enough to be dangerous. I wonder if maybe we could invite we actually have a housing policy team at Commerce. We have 2 new policy teams that joined us in September. One was my team from climate, and then the other was the housing policy team. And they have a full presentation. They could give you a nice 20-minute presentation of all of they actually have regulations where mandatory elements that have to be incorporated, and could speak a lot more eloquently about what those are than I can.
Sarah,
Yeah,
thanks so much.
Our
Thank you.
our other senior planner, Robin, is working on the housing needs assessment and is working on hiring a consultant at this moment. I don't know if she did a study session with council yet, but you know, in California, the state has basically mandated that, like, there's basically no more single family housing in California, and so while it's voluntary, you know, we have an opportunity as a city to kind of do it on our terms rather than having it kind of mandated by the state, mandating, you know, like zoning and whatnot. So that is kind of the discussion I think that Robin is going to be bringing to the housing needs assessment, that, you know, we could, you know, do this now and do it in the Gig Harbor way, or we could wait until the state gets sick of people not upzoning and mandate it from a top, you know, as a top down approach. So something to think about as we, because that is coming down the line.
I mean, the good news is we have a state that people want to move to, even though if you look at all of those, like, you see those different like survey results that come out and rank states of like, where's the best place to retire? Where's the best place to, you know, whatever. Washington's usually at the bottom of the list for affordability, but we seem to be at the top of the list of where people actually do end up moving, and we're growing versus other states. So there's my upbeat message. People like it here. We just need to make room. Oh, there's another question from Barbara.
Yeah, I actually have a couple. The first thing is that it looks like you guys are coming up with draft policies that only address greenhouse gas emissions. So there are other climate related impacts that we're expecting and planning for, but you're not going to limit that. It's just that what you're going to offer is going to be limited to greenhouse gas, correct?
No, actually, we are providing measures that address both mitigation for greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation for VMT, but also resilience to make cities more resilient. So in fact, I think we have probably more measures, draft measures right now in the resilience realm than we do in the mitigation realm. And so those resilience measures are some of the things. What Michael brought one forward today, but it was on the emergency management side. But there's also along the lines of, you know, increasing, you know, green spaces and connecting, you know, natural infrastructure to better, you know, ensure that a city can bounce back from some of these events that happen.
Okay. And then my next question was going to be whether or not you're going to have a model sophisticated enough for us to kind of put in scenarios or trials, certain ideas. So say, for example, you know, one of your options might be to figure out, get everybody off of any kind of natural gas or petroleum based heating, and then be able to run that through a model to see what we would expect based on how much of that is used in this area, and then be able to use that to come up with targets.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. if you choose, if you're able and willing to to put together an emission inventory, the emission inventory will at a local level, at your level, will show you kind of what your most significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions are, and then from there, you know, there would be there be the sample menu of goals and measures that, you know, you can start to examine within within your own planning group, and say, okay, I think what we based on emission inventory, we want to make these targets, and then from these targets, we want to try to reduce these emissions with X type of measures, and then, you know, policies and goals that go along with those. So, you know, you should be able, the idea, I mean, and I'm not going to just disappear after these come out. I mean, the idea is that we're going to be available to ask. You can call me up, ask questions. You know, it's not going to just end with us plunking this out. So, so that, you know, the idea is for us to be here to help you, you know, push through this, you know, and help you as necessary. So when you know, so if you want to try something out, and, you know, I mean, if it came to it, you know, call up Ecology, call up WashDOT, say, hey, you know, Gig Harbor is wanting to do this. What can we do to help them to figure out if this is going to be successful?
Because I was just wondering if you were going to have a tool like that we could use to help us kind of do our decision making in terms of helping us calculate, you know, the benefits we might expect from choosing certain policies. Is that in place, or on a wish list, or highly unlikely?
Well, there's probably many ways to answer this, but our particular model element is not going to be like a calculator, so to speak, so it won't calculate scenarios for you. But one of the things that we've been collecting from the beginning are a lot of tools like what you've just described. And our hope is that we'll have resources that we've vetted for you and say, well, this one here really does that particular aspect for you. And rather than handing you 100 resources and asking you to try to find your way through them. And so even though we're not planning to develop that at this point, there are tools like that out there. Roger.
Thanks. Actually, this is more for Roxy, but along the lines of emission inventories or emission estimates, I'm assuming one of those two are going to be in our near future for Gig Harbor as part of our plan.
Yeah, so I can take this. So we received money from, or we're not under contract yet, but we've what's the word? We got this
awarded.
Awarded. Yes, thank you. There's still a process to like get the money or whatever, but yeah, we were awarded this grant. Thank you, Sarah. And so part of the climate action plan will be doing an emissions assessment, a greenhouse gas emissions assessment. So we'll work out the details of what the timeline and everything looks like once we get a consultant on board. And consultants are kind of hard to find right now, but yeah, that will be coming down the pike. Okay, Kyla, let's make this Kyla the last question so that we can take a break and get to Kyla's presentation.
Of course, I'm muted. I just have a quick comment. I wanted to share that Pierce County's long range planning team that works on our comp plan has been involved in the process of developing this suite of policies with Commerce. And I got a chance to look over some of the draft where it's at right now recently with the long range planning team. And I'm just very impressed. I think it's a great suite of policies. And I think seeing the whole list together really helped us see like where there are still some gaps, or we can still find some new examples of policies to help fill some of those gaps. So I just wanted to share that, Pierce County's been involved in this process. So if you have questions about it, you can always ask our team as well. And I think it's going to be a really useful tool.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you.
All right, so let's take a 5-minute break. Let's come back at 3:01. Thank you all for your participation. I'll see you in a few minutes. Great, welcome back, everybody. So next we're going to hear from Kyla Wilson. Kyla is a sustainability coordinator with Pierce County. I believe it's Planning and Public Works, right? Yes, great. Okay, Kyla, I will click through. Just let me know. Take it
Great,
away.
thank you. Yeah. So Roxy invited my team to talk about waste and its connection to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and what that might mean for Gig Harbor's comp plan and maybe future climate action plan. And so I just want to preface that I am not on the solid waste team. We have a few different teams within the Sustainable Resources Division. We do manage solid waste services. So we do have a team of folks who do that. None of them could make today's meeting, but one of my favorite things to talk about is waste. So I was happy to give this presentation. I work on our sustainability team, so I help implement the Sustainability 2030 plan. Let's get started. So just for some context, what we think of as the waste system is traditionally, landfill, so solid waste that things that cannot be recycled or composted go to the landfill. We also have our wastewater system, so our sewer system and the treatment of that wastewater is also kind of part of our waste system. And then there are those things that do get recycled into new materials. So we have yard waste collection here in Pierce County, and all of that yard waste gets ground up and turned into compost. So it has a second life as a soil amendment. And we also have our recycling system. So when you think about climate and how climate is impacted by the waste system, solid waste tends to create methane emissions because anything that is organic, so things that were once alive, are mostly composed of carbon. We're made of carbon, and the food we eat is made of carbon, and lots of other materials. And when those things decompose in anaerobic conditions, so without air, when they're buried in the ground, they break down and create methane. And so that's one source of greenhouse gas emissions that our waste stream creates. There's also kind of similar emissions that come from our wastewater treatment facilities, and even yard waste that's breaking down, decomposing, and turning into compost with all these great microbes that are breaking down that material into smaller pieces. Those microbes emit carbon dioxide because they breathe. They're just like animals, right? They're eating that plant material, breaking it down, and they also emit carbon dioxide. And then our recycling system definitely reduces greenhouse gas emissions because we're reusing materials that don't have to then be produced as virgin materials. So, for example, mining brand new aluminum requires a huge amount of emissions, a huge amount of fossil fuel infrastructure that goes into extracting that material. So producing aluminum brand new is very resource intensive, creates lots of emissions. When we recycle our cans, we're able to reuse that metal and not have to use virgin materials. So we're there for saving those emissions. But recycling is not a perfect system either. There's only so many times certain materials can be recycled. And of course, they do have to get melted down, remanufactured. So there are some emissions released in those processes as well. So that's just a quick overview of what we traditionally think of as our waste system. And we click one more slide there. This is a breakdown of Pierce County's greenhouse gas emissions in 2015. And the top kind of red slice there is solid waste, which is 3% of our overall county emissions. There's also a small gray slice next to it, which is wastewater at 1%. So our waste system creates about 4% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. It's not a big chunk, but it is part of our strategy for reducing overall emissions. There are still opportunities to reduce those emissions. So, and as PSRC mentioned during their presentation a few sessions back, we are going to have new data available soon through that 4-county emissions inventory update. So we will get new data actually for 2015 with a new methodology, and we'll also get new 2019 data so we can do a comparison. So that will be coming very soon. I was hoping we would have it by now so that I could share it with you, so we could look at the most recent kind of waste emissions from 2019. But we just got the final draft to review, so it's not quite ready to share yet. But I think in another week or two it will be. So slide. And as I mentioned, I work on our Sustainability 2030 plan, which was developed in 2020 and signed into effect in 2021. And we're going to be updating it periodically. So starting next year, actually, we're going to do an update to the plan so that we're keeping it relevant and fresh to our community. And it has these 77 actions across 5 focus areas, one of which is consumption and waste management, because it is one of those pieces of the pie that we do want to address with our greenhouse gas reductions. But I think it is important to acknowledge that it is not nearly as significant as our buildings and energy or as transportation. So slide. Looking a little closer at what these actions are that we're addressing in the 2030 plan. We've got a few that are kind of complete and ongoing, and some that we're started working on or in progress, but are maybe a little bit more future timeline, things that we'll work on a little bit more in the coming years. So a couple things that we have already done is a recycling campaign that focuses on high greenhouse gas impact materials. So the materials that have the biggest reduction in emissions by recycling them are paper, metal, and cardboard, because creating new paper, cardboard, and metal all requires a lot of emissions. And these are materials that are easy to recycle and can be reused multiple times. So they have great markets. We don't have to worry about whether or not someone's going to buy them and use those recycled materials. There's definitely, folks who are purchasing recycled paper, metal, and cardboard. So that's why we wanted to focus on these materials and do a lot of communication and outreach to our community on how to best recycle these materials, make sure that you are recycling them. So we have a Wasteless Wednesday campaign that went out on social media. And it's a recurring thing. It started last year for sharing this message with community members. We also created some educational videos about recycling and what happens after you put it in the bin. What are those end markets? How's it being used? So those have been really popular and gotten a lot of traction, and they complement a lot of the other outreach that our waste reduction and recycling team is working on. The other thing that we already do and will continue doing is capture methane from the landfill. So right now we have wells in our landfill that help capture some of that methane, and it actually gets used by homes that live near the landfill, so that methane is going into the natural gas pipeline, and it's getting used in those homes. And we don't capture all of the methane, is what I would say here. So that's something that we're kind of working towards, is capturing more of that methane. We capture about 50% of the methane produced by the landfill right now. The other thing that we are working on and will continue to do is to support gleaning and food recovery through programs like Harvest Pierce County. So making sure there is less food waste going into our landfill is a great way of preventing methane emissions in the first place. And it's also great for just making sure that that food gets eaten and goes to folks who need it. So that's, if you're not familiar with gleaning, gleaning is when you go and collect all of the harvest at the end of the season, usually. So for example, when a commercial potato farmer does their harvest, there's usually still some potatoes in the ground. Maybe they weren't quite ready to go to market at the time when the harvest happened, or maybe they're kind of like a weird shape or size or something. So gleaning teams at Harvest Pierce County will go out and collect that produce and distribute it to food banks and things like that. So this is really popular in the city of Tacoma, where they go and collect all of the apples and pears from people's fruit trees in their yards as well. So that's what gleaning is. It's recovering food, making sure that that food doesn't go to waste. Some things that we have in progress for the future is to incentivize construction and demolition recycling as well. So we have quite a bit of construction waste and wood waste that currently goes into our landfill. I'm trying to find alternative avenues for that to be recycled and reused in buildings, if it's still salvageable. And another thing that we will keep working on is food waste recycling. So there's food recovery, making sure that that food that is still edible can get eaten, but there's always going to be food scraps. And right now, our yard waste system doesn't take that food waste. And there was a bill that passed in this last session, the state level, HB 1799, which is a new requirement for food waste recycling. And so we're going to have to do some exploring and figure out what that means for Pierce County. But that's a big way of reducing our emissions, because it is that organic matter when it ends up in the landfill that creates the methane in the first place. Some of the other things we're looking at is an internal sustainable purchasing group. This is kind of internal to the county. So working with finance and other departments to make good decisions about the materials we produce, or not produce, that we purchase. So, purchasing recycled content paper and other materials. And this also kind of extends to thinking about the decisions we make about our fleet and other big purchases like that. And something that's also more future facing is thinking about how we are going to incorporate kind of new technology that, like solar panels and batteries, how are these things going to be collected and recycled? So that's something that, we haven't, there's probably not enough of it yet that's being produced, but it's definitely something that's coming up. Some of those solar panels that were installed 30 years ago are starting to need to be replaced. So that's definitely something on the horizon to consider. Next slide. So we have these actions in the Sustainability 2030 plan, but there's actually a much bigger plan around solid waste that also has actions in it that align with the actions we have in the sustainability plan. And that's the solid and hazardous waste management plan. So this is a countywide plan that gets adopted by all the cities and towns in Pierce County as well. And this is the 20-year plan for how we manage all of solid waste. So this is a really big plan, kind of like the comp plan. It's got this really big timeline, and it sets lots of goals and requirements for our solid waste service. So if you click one more time, there should be a little animation here. Great, yeah. So there's lots of different goals within the solid and hazardous waste management plan, but we have 3 sustainability goals that have actions that fall underneath them. The first goal is to reduce waste and improve recycling effectiveness. Goal 2 is to protect the environment and human health by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and delivering solid waste services. And action 3, or goal 3, is to make the solid and hazardous waste system more accessible and equitable for all Pierce County customers. So some of this relates to some of those actions in the Sustainability 2030 plan, but they go a little bit deeper and are a little bit more solid waste system focused, I would say. So go to the next slide. I think this new plan that's just been developed in 2021, this brand new solid and hazardous waste management plan, really exemplifies some shifts that we've seen in the waste management system, especially if you think about it in comparison to the last big solid and hazardous waste management plan we had back in 2000. What we're seeing is a much greater focus on waste reduction. So really thinking about the top of that waste hierarchy, how can we reduce any waste entering the system to begin with before we start thinking about that end disposal, like having to send things to landfill. So definitely a lot of the actions in this plan are structured about reducing as much as possible and thinking about any kind of recycling or end disposal as like kind of a last resort. It's the last thing you want to have to do with materials. The other big focus is on greenhouse gas emissions. So this definitely complements the sustainability plan. Historically, I think, I would say we've measured the success of a solid waste system by how much you are diverting out of the system. So like the percentage that's going to recycling versus solid waste is how we've measured success. But that's kind of problematic, right? Because it's, having a large volume then seems good, right? Like having a huge amount of tonnage diverted is good, but what we really want to see overall is a total reduction in tonnage. And while high diversion rates are great, we know that there are also problems with the recycling system. So I think focusing on greenhouse gas emissions really has kind of a wider lens about the total impact of that waste on our community. So this kind of shifts the focus away from just total tonnage, how much waste is going to landfill versus recycling, and more towards what are the overall emissions created by that waste. So that's something that I think we'll have to develop some new kind of metrics and tools for measuring, and that's part of the goals in the solid and hazardous waste management plan as well. And the last shift that we've really seen is a more of a focus on equity of service and accessibility to the solid waste system. So thinking about how do our multifamily customers, what's their access to recycling like? And our commercial, our small businesses, do they have the resources to recycle materials correctly? Because many of our commercial customers are not actually required to have recycling service at all. So how do we reach out to customers and make sure that they know that they can actually benefit from that service? They can actually earn money by recycling materials like cardboard. So next slide. Yeah, I just wanted to touch briefly on those co-benefits of this focus on greenhouse gas emissions is instead of just thinking about, how much waste are we removing or recycling, thinking about how we can also benefit from new kind of jobs and pathways that focusing on greenhouse gas reduction brings. How can we enhance public health and promote equity, improve our air quality, and improve water quality when we think of it more holistically in our total impacts of the waste system. Next slide. Okay, so this is a ton of text. I just wanted to put this in here so that you have this resource to look back on in the slides. But this just goes into more detail on all of the sustainability actions that are in the solid and hazardous waste management plan. So you can see, well, the first action listed here is improve equitability of garbage rates or expand our community cleanup coupon program. So these are a couple of options available to us to make sure that it's not an inequitable burden on certain communities to have this essential service, right? Like if you are a low income resident and you have a bunch of stuff that needs to go to the landfill, maybe you're moving and you have to get rid of a bunch of things, it can be super expensive to pay the tipping fee at the landfill. So One thing that we started doing this last year is piloting this coupon program where we work with community-based organizations to distribute coupons so that it's not as expensive to pay that tipping fee. We're also focusing on multifamily services, as I mentioned, creating those greenhouse gas reduction metrics to use for measuring our success, and also looking at how we can support state level legislation on things like packaging that has a lower greenhouse gas impact, and looking towards capturing more methane emissions at the landfill, and also how we can continue to promote and better support our extended producer responsibility programs. So you might be aware of like the paint care program. So we have a special program for collecting paint, sort of like electronic waste, these kind of separate programs that help keep our waste safer, keeps dangerous chemicals or batteries and things like that out of the landfill, and also puts some of that onus back on the producers of the materials. So like the paint care program is paid for by companies that produce paint. They have to pay a fee to make sure that that paint is captured separately and is recycled properly. So thinking about how we can better support those programs and expand them. Next slide. All right, so future innovations, things that are a little bit further out there, but things we're considering at Pierce County. I mentioned the food waste recycling is going to be a really big part of how we manage waste in the future, and it's kind of an upcoming challenge, opportunity. And as I just mentioned, extended producer responsibility programs. There's been state legislation a few years in a row now to have a EPR program for packaging. So that's something that we track, and we'll keep thinking about, is if that passes, it would really change our whole recycling system. So we need to be prepared for that, and how we might have to pivot and change the way we do our collection and our services if it's going to start being paid for by packaging producers. And working towards that 100% landfill methane capture, and reducing methane production as much as possible. One way that we can use that methane is also potentially as an alternative fuel. So as a green compressed natural gas fuel for heavy duty vehicles. There's other landfills that do this, and it's something that we can consider doing. We can also look at what electrifying our waste hauling fleet would look like. So is it feasible to do electric garbage trucks? How much might that cost us? And what are the potential benefits? So there's a picture here of an all electric garbage truck that I believe is destined for New York City. So what can Gig Harbor do? So as I mentioned, this plan covers the whole county and will also get adopted by Gig Harbor. And I think of that as like the actions that are in that plan are kind of the minimum requirement, but there are these opportunities to go a little bit beyond what's set out in the solid and hazardous waste management plan. One thing that the county is required to do is a CROP, which is another acronym for reducing contamination through outreach. So that's something that is required by ecology for, I believe it's municipalities over 35,000. So any larger cities and counties need to develop a community outreach plan for how they're going to reduce recycling contamination. So we have a separate set of actions for that at the county level as well. But there's a lot of really great examples of other cities that are doing really great outreach and education to improve our recycling system and make sure that it is reducing emissions as much as possible, that it's as clean and free of contamination, so it's highly marketable. We want to have good, clean recycling that gets recycled and not going to landfill. So I put an example here of the city of Tacoma. They did a recycle reset program back starting in 2018 after the China sword kind of really changed the game for recycling contamination. And they started a community ambassador program. I believe they piloted it last year. And that's something you could think about. I know it definitely requires a little bit more staff capacity, but being able to train community ambassadors who can talk to their neighbors, go out, do recycling lid lifts and things like that, and really reach out to people on a more personal level. So that has been a really successful program from what I've heard at the city of Tacoma. Of course, I think, it's something that Pierce County, we're also really focused on reducing contamination and doing education. So we'd be happy to support anything Gig Harbor wants to do in terms of recycling education for sure. I also mentioned that EPR legislation, so making producers more responsible for the materials that they make and sell to us, tracking that legislation at the state level and potentially engaging in support through other organizations. So like the Washington State Recycling Association, there's lots of different local and regional groups that you can get involved in if you want to be more involved in that EPR legislation process. And that's also the last point on this list, which is to get more involved in regional collaboration and find more of those resources through some of our existing networks. So I put down a couple that I'm aware of and have engaged in, but there are of course many others out there. The other point on this list is to promote sharing and waste prevention programs. So we've talked a little bit about the emissions that come from our waste system, but that's really just the waste that ends up in Pierce County, in our trash cans, in our recycling bins. There's so much waste that's produced upstream in the production of those materials. So, if you order something from Amazon, gets delivered to your house here somewhere in the county, we might get, that cardboard box in recycling, and maybe 6 months from now when that product dies, it ends up in our landfill. But there was waste created elsewhere in the world or elsewhere in the country where that product was produced. And all of that emissions, happened elsewhere, and we can't capture it in our inventory. It wasn't produced locally, but that kind of consumption-based emissions is also a huge contributor to climate change and our individual impact as consumers and community members. So I think these networks for sharing, there's organizations like Buy Nothing that help connect neighbors to each other so that they can share more resources, really helps reduce the amount that we consume as individuals. It means that instead of spending our money on products that we maybe don't need and instead can borrow, we can spend that money locally on, going to the local theater or, on more cultural experiences that don't involve large amounts of greenhouse gas production. So some examples of those kind of communities would be like the Tacoma Tool Library. There's also so Tool Library is very focused on like DIY kind of materials, tools, lawn care equipment, but there are other kind of libraries of things. So I put an example here of the Beaverton City Library of Things, which is in Oregon, and they have all kinds of other things like board games and bird watching kits, and you can go borrow all these things actually from their local library as well. So you can check out, just like you would check out a library book, you could check out all these other cool things that then you don't have to own as an individual. You can just borrow, use a couple of times, and then return. So I will stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyla. Kyla, do we have some questions?
See Georgina?
Yeah, hi, Kyla. That was really interesting. I really appreciate it. It brought up a few things for me, having moved here from California. And the whole idea of recycling contamination is a big deal. You got to the point where you understood that if you put an item in there that contaminated the recycling, that recycling would be all put into landfill. And so one thing I've noted when I've come here, other than there doesn't seem to be as much education about that, and I don't know if you do the same thing here, that it all gets thrown into landfill if it is contaminated. But the milk cartons here have the little plastic thing that, you know, I think twice about putting that into recycling because it has plastic in it. So there are things like that. I mean, that's just one example of where you can contaminate, you know, the landfill. So I'd like to ask that question, and then I do have another comment after.
Yeah, I think the game with recycling has really changed, or we've really been illuminated to some of the issues that probably have always existed in the recycling system. And that's that a lot of our recycling was being sent overseas, and it's being recycled in China. And we didn't have a lot of control then over what the, you know, how it gets used, right? So turns out that a lot of that recycling was really just going to like energy production, like it's getting burnt basically, or it's getting recycled, but in really inhumane kind of environments. So, you know, bad for workers, bad for public health. And that's why China wanted to try and shut down a lot of the recycling they were receiving that was highly contaminated, as they were trying to protect human rights. And it really, you know, changed our recycling system because we couldn't send any dirty recycling out anymore. I mean, I think there were other markets that opened up. There's other countries that started taking some of that dirty recycling, but that's not really what we want to be promoting. So luckily we do have some local recycling as well. There's a recycling company in Oregon that takes a lot of our recycling, and we're starting to see more domestic recycling pick up. But that means that we do need to keep contamination low, because dirty recycling is not easy to recycle and it's not safe. So I think that's one thing that I think is important to think about when you're putting stuff in your recycling bin, is like, would I want to dig through this? Because there are people who work in their recycling facilities who sort through your recycling. Some of it is done by machines, there's optical sorters, but there are also just people who have to dig through that stuff and make sure it gets separated correctly. So, you know, I think about that when I think about like how, you know, did I wash this container out before I put it in my recycling? Because it's going to be gross on the other, you know, the folks who have to deal with it on the other end. And yeah, so carton is actually not accepted in the recycling system here in Pierce County because it is a composite material. Carton is a mixture of paperboard and plastic, and some of those aseptic ones, like what you might get your soy milk or something in, also has a lining of aluminum between the plastic and the paper. So we don't have the recycling infrastructure locally to separate those materials. So that's something that should go in your trash can. If you frequent like the Tacoma drop-off recycling center, their transfer and landfill center, you can recycle the caps, the plastic caps. They have a bin for those. Now, I don't know where those plastics go, but they do collect some of those kind of other plastics that can't go into your curbside bin. But yeah, I mean, that I think is, you know, really why we wanted to focus our recycling education on paper, metal, and cardboard, because we know that those can get recycled. You know, there's lots of questions about plastics and how recyclable they are.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it, because they need to change some of the signage because it just says milk cartons, and so obviously they can't be recycled. So it's good to know that. The other thing is, in Monterey County, they do have the alternative fuel actually at the waste management landfill place, and so they keep their landfill covered with plastic because so that the methane doesn't eliminate. But then they develop the alternative fuels, and the garbage trucks come in and they unload, and then as they go out, they fill up with the alternative fuel. So it's really a great system. So I thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a great example, and that's definitely something we want to consider. Yeah, we do have our landfill is lined as well, so we are capturing some of that methane. What we would need to figure out is usually you have to upgrade the gas that comes off of the landfill. You have to do a certain amount of scrubbing because it's not super clean. So you have to upgrade that gas so that it's safe for vehicles to run off of. But that's definitely something we want to look into.
Yeah, they've just built this whole facility that takes care of that. So it's kind of neat thinking of the garbage trucks coming in and then going out and filling up with an alternative fuel. So anyway.
Yeah, and I do think that that compressed natural gas does burn a little cleaner than diesel. So when you think about that garbage truck driving through our neighborhoods, it's going to create less local air pollution.
Right.
All right, see Roger has hand up as well.
And just a note about time. Let's go
Okay.
Roger, Jenny, Barbara, Ann. I do have just a short presentation about community outreach after this, but go ahead, Roger.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just real quick. Thanks, Kyla. And I know you and I have discussed this whole thing about recycling earlier on this year, I think with one of the citizens that set something up. Again, I just get kind of puzzled and somewhat frustrated on what we can do. I mean, it seems like even since I've moved to Gig Harbor, it's the amount of recycling has just been dropping and dropping, and the kinds of things that we can recycle are starting to get limited just almost now to just a paper and cardboard. Probably there's more of a market for it. But I at times I just don't know what the heck we actually can do to get people to recycle more and then to clean it up. I mean, at home, I've always felt guilty about washing stuff before I throw it in the recycle bin. But it's becoming apparent now that that is probably one of the more efficient ways of doing this. I'm not sure what Gig Harbor could do. We don't operate our own city landfill. We don't operate our own city collection services. We are pretty much at, excuse me, pretty much at the will and mercy of, our local collection agency, who seems to be reducing what we actually can recycle. I'm curious, and I think I asked you this before, how do companies like Ridwell accept more things that our local recycling collectors just won't even look at, like, for instance, plastic wraps. And I think at the time you said you weren't even sure how they did it, and hopefully it was, some sort of a legitimate operation. But anyway, I think it's more of a comment than an actual question.
That was my question too. How about companies like Ridwell? Is that something we should encourage in the area or no?
Yeah, that's hard for me to say because I don't know a whole lot about how Ridwell operates. There are other kind of private companies that do similar things too, like Tetracycle has been a program that's been around for a while that used to take Cliff Bar wrappers and all kinds of other smaller plastics. And because they're private companies, it's hard to know exactly, there's not as much transparency about maybe where it goes and how it's being used. So I can't say for sure whether we should be encouraging customers to use those services. There are also things you have to pay for, right? Like you have to pay an extra fee to have a Ridwell subscription versus, participating in curbside recycling is free of charge if you're, a resident. So yeah, I have questions there too. I wish I knew more. My assumption is that because these are kind of like national level companies, they're collecting little bits of these plastics from all over, and then they are finding buyers for them on the recycling market, or they're working with, I think like Tetracycle was maybe producing like phone cases or something through another company with some of those plastics. So yeah, I don't know. But I think it is harder for our waste haulers to collect some of those materials because it's just hard to find good end markets for them. not highly desirable materials to work with.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you then. So let's go to the soy milk containers that have the aluminum in there. Is there any equipment that can handle the recycling of this and we just don't have it in Pierce County?
Yeah, you can't. There are lots of other countries that recycle carton, and it's very popular in Northern Europe. And the way that that material is usually recycled, that kind of paperboard, plastic, aluminum composite, is kind of like in a big kind of blender washing machine. So you grind it up and you float it in water, and so paper will float to the top because it has low density. And some of the plastics and metals will kind of settle out. And so that's how they separate them. And so then that paper can be used to make things like egg cartons, maybe cereal boxes, those like thinner cardboards. And the plastic and aluminum, I think there's not a great market for that, little bits of plastic and aluminum that come off of that. So that maybe goes to a waste to energy plant where it's burnt for energy, or it goes to landfill. And I know that, because I have insider information on this, because I used to I spent a summer working at Tetra Pak, which produces a lot of those carton materials, milk cartons and things like that. And they were looking for end markets for that plastic aluminum combo that comes out of the recycling machines. And I think they were working with like a company in Japan that was interested in using it as like an insulator for cables. And so they're looking for ways to reuse that material, but there's not a huge demand for it right now either.
Okay, and one last question, which is going to sound really odd, I think, but do garbage disposals do anything to help with this?
So when you put something down the garbage disposal, it goes to our wastewater treatment plant. So I think different municipalities have given different guidance on whether you should use your garbage disposal to dispose of food scraps. I'm not sure what our wastewater treatment plant recommends on that. But it goes through kind of a similar decomposition process with wastewater system. So it gets digested by microbes, and we end up with biosolids. And in Pierce County, we turn some of those biosolids into SoundGrow, which is a great fertilizer that's produced from waste. So instead of having to buy, like fertilizer that's made out of fossil fuel inputs, you can buy fertilizer made from our wastewater system. So food scraps that go down the disposal would end up as part of that biosolid. But if everyone used the garbage disposal to get rid of all their food scraps, it might become a bit of an issue, right? So there's only so much organic matter that our wastewater treatment facility is prepared to take on as well.
Thank you.
Please don't put them down your please.
Why are you shaking your head, Director Langham? Do you not like garbage disposals?
Oh, no, I was following up on Barbara Ann's comment of please do not have a garbage disposal if you have a septic system. It will destroy your septic system.
Yeah, okay. Okay, good enough, thanks.
All right.
And otherwise, if you're on sewer, how you feel about garbage disposals in the city of Gig Harbor?
Remaining neutral on it. We're not going to promote it. We're not going to push people away from it.
Thank you.
Hey, as an inspector, you don't want them on your, you shouldn't be doing your table scraps in it to begin with. It's bad for your plumbing of your house. It should just be the little bits that are left on the plate. That's it.
Thank you, everyone, for this plumbing lesson. Thank you so much, Kyla. Really appreciate it. I think you all should have Kyla's email if you want to ask her any more questions. I'm just going to give a brief overview of community outreach since it is important for climate. What am I trying to say? It's important for climate change action plans. So here we go. Okay, so community engagement. Everything that's orange and underlined in this presentation is a link. So when you go to open the presentation up from our website, you can click on it and read more yourself. So these are just some principles of effective community engagement from MRSC. And I'll go over each of these in more detail. So engaging vulnerable populations in frontline communities. Sarah Fox kind of talked about frontline communities, and what that means is communities that will be most affected by climate change, meaning folks that are low income, don't have the ability to move to different places, folks in places that are burdened by urban heat islands because they haven't been invested in with good infrastructure and urban trees. So there are a lot of ways to engage with folks that maybe don't have the same access to time off to go to community meetings and maybe the same technology resources. So there are a lot of ways to go beyond just like an online survey, because surveys are just one way of doing outreach. And I'm hoping that we can get some of you involved in doing outreach when it comes to that time. We're going to have the consultant on board by then, but these are some resources if you want to look through them. Building authentic relationships. I am a community organizer in like my free time, and I do know that building authentic relationships does not happen overnight when you're trying to get to the root of what people need. They need to be able to trust you. And I just wanted to emphasize that some folks, some communities will never trust certain people or organizations because of their experience or background, and won't want to engage with a public organization or a nonprofit or certain groups of people because of that. And that's okay. The best that we can do in some instances is to give them the information that's available and let them engage on their own. So that also ties into trust, and that participants' involvement should be meaningful and not tokenized. Usually people know when they're being tokenized, and that will make them lose trust and not want to engage. Designing with care. This means not assuming that everyone can come to your outreach event at 12 p.m. on a Wednesday, or that everyone's interested in coming to a farmer's market. Just considering that there are a lot of things that go into people being present and being able to attend an event. Childcare, food availability, translation services, materials in different languages are all, and access considerations like translators and ASL interpreters are all ways that we can make folks comfortable and help them participate. Meet people where they are. This kind of goes in line with designing with care. Leverage existing channels and events. So usually in my experience doing community outreach, going to events that are already on community calendars and already exist in the community is going to be a lot more effective than assuming folks will want to take time out of their day, get childcare, whatever it is, to come to City Hall to put stickers on a poster board. So going to community events is really important in gathering meaningful feedback. And then when necessary, when possible, pay for people's time and expertise. Lived experience is expertise. And I think, you know, we bandy about this term equity and a lot. And I think that these surveys and interviews tend to burden Black and brown folks a lot, because there are a lot of people trying to extract knowledge from them, trying to extract ideas. How do we do better? Yada, yada. Trying to glean knowledge from their lived experience, which is expertise when we're talking about equity and we're talking about inclusion. So I just wanted to emphasize that we have to invest in equity. That's all I had to say about community engagement. I know that was kind of rapid fire, but I want to make sure we end on time. Jason, you had a question?
Yeah, I did. I really appreciate all of this, but particularly on that last slide, that's been a big meaty policy question with our commissioners about whether or not to pay citizens to participate. So have you gotten direction from your council that that's what Gig Harbor is going to do?
No, not at all. These are principles of effective engagement I got from MRSC. But in my personal experience, I have found that people are a lot more interested in participating and will like really give you their full selves if they're compensated. People don't necessarily want little like trinkets or I don't know, a gift card to Quiznos or whatever. You know,
Yeah.
time is money.
Yeah, it's great. I'm just trying to gather some examples for our organization to give our policymakers. Thanks.
Any other questions about engagement? Okay, well, those resources will all be there for you on the CCC PAC website. I didn't get a chance to say thank you to Sarah Fox, Gary Eidelberg, and Michael Burnham before they left. I sent them an email saying as much, but I really appreciate their contributions. Thank you so much to Kyla for your expertise, and thank you, Jason, for taking notes. Really appreciate it. If you can email me those at your earliest convenience, I'd really appreciate it. Don't forget to email me your homework. And if it takes you some time to get the homework out of your dog's mouth and, you know, from the previous sessions, I'm still happy to receive it. Don't care if it's a little tattered. Please send in your policies and goals from, you know, our previous sessions. So, and thank you, Cindy, so much for doing tech work. I will see you all August 23rd. Enjoy your month off from CCC PAC meetings. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Roxy.